Kalorama, a recorded book's Highbridge imprint, presents The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, Exposing Climate Lies in an Age of Disinformation, by Jerome Corsi, Ph.D. Forward by Mark Morano. Read by Bob Souer. Forward by Mark Morano. I first met Jerry Corsi back in 2004, and I was immediately struck by how he was a focused and prodigious investigative journalist. Corsi cited my investigative reporting on John Kerry's military service during the Vietnam War in his 2004 New York Times bestseller with John O'Neill, Unfit for Command: Swiftboat Veterans Speak Out Against John Kerry. Corsi has been an investigative machine over the past several decades, exposing, revealing, and debunking the major news events of our time, including books on climate and energy matters. This book, The Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, Exposing Climate Lies in an Age of Disinformation on Climate and Energy, is perhaps Jerry's career tour de force. Jerry masterfully tackles the alleged climate crisis and the folly of the green energy solutions. I was honored to find out that Jerry dedicated this book to me. I have been working as an environmental reporter since the early 1990s and have been on the climate change beat for over 2 decades. I battled climate hysteria, groupthink, and the meaningless solutions while working in the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee when Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma was chairman. It was a pleasure to work for Senator Inhofe, who literally had the courage to stand alone against the climate establishment and oppose then-President Barack Obama's cap-and-trade climate taxes. I founded the C-Facts Climate Depot website in 2009, and I have strived to make the website serve as a balance for the atrocious climate and energy reporting by the mainstream media. I also produced and appeared in 2016's Climate Hustle film and the sequel in 2020, Climate Hustle 2. In a nutshell, anthropogenic climate change threats and so-called solutions are one of the biggest cons being imposed on the public in recent decades. It has never been about the climate, energy, or the environment. The climate agenda is about the takeover of our economy using an unscientific climate scare to achieve their ends. The climate scare is a backdoor way for progressives to impose central planning, socialism, and progressivism on the once free West. Everything we cherish, from our homes to the foods we eat, the vehicles we drive, our ability to travel, and our freedoms, is at stake if the manufactured climate fear campaign succeeds. Luckily, we don't face a climate emergency, but if we did and had to rely on meaningless United Nations climate pacts or the Green New Deal to save us, we would all be doomed. It is a pleasure to be part of this book and to have Jerry's great reporting acumen once again injecting science and logic into the climate change and energy debate. Jerry spares no aspects of the climate and energy debate and takes a deep dive into the complexities of the issues. He is unafraid to re-examine controversial scientific theories that may ruffle feathers on all sides of the climate and energy debate. The goal is to get Jerry's book into the hands of as many citizens, journalists, and policymakers as possible. Only armed with the facts can we unite and defeat the well-funded, embedded, and scientifically twisted climate change movement. Introduction. The 21st Century Save the Earth Climate Delusion. No longer are cap-and-trade, carbon dioxide taxes, and more solar and wind the promoted solutions to alleged global warming. Now we can add gender justice and defunding the police. Mark Morano, Green Fraud, 2021. In this book you will learn why most of what you think you know about energy and what our kids are being taught about energy is flat out wrong. In one of the worst ironies of history, a frantic global movement to eliminate fossil fuels, the foundation of modern life, has achieved comprehensive power throughout the developed world at the very moment when the supply of those resources, especially in the United States, has exploded. Stephen Moore and Kathleen Hartnett White, Fueling Freedom, 2016. Having first experienced and then studied the phenomenon for 15 years, I believe that secular people are attracted to apocalyptic environmental movements because it meets some of the same psychological and spiritual needs as Judeo-Christianity and other religions. Apocalyptic environmentalism gives people a purpose to save the world from climate change or some other environmental disaster. It provides people with a story that casts them as heroes, which some scholars, as we will see, believe we need in order to find meaning in our lives. Michael Schellenberger, Apocalypse Never, 2020. In 1895, French conservative thinker Gustave Le Bon wrote a seminal book entitled The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. In the introduction to that book, Le Bon clarified that profound changes in people's ideas are the actual cause of great upheavals that preceded civilization changes, like the fall of the Roman Empire. He explained that the transformation humanity was then experiencing had a base cause in the destruction of the religious, political, and social beliefs that grounded civilization. He felt his era was in transition and anarchy as modern scientific and industrial discoveries created new conditions of existence. He observed that the past ideas, although half destroyed, were still compelling, while the new ideas replacing them were yet in the process of transformation. Le Bon could have written that exact introduction today. In Chapter 4, A Religious Shape Assumed by All the Conviction of Crowds, Le Bon expressed his disdain for democracy. He felt crowds swept democracies through irrational historical moments where bizarre secular ideas assumed a religious-like popular devotion. The following paragraph from Chapter 4 summarized his concerns as follows. We have shown that crowds do not reason, that they accept or reject ideas as a whole, that they tolerate neither discussion nor contradiction, and that the suggestions brought to bear on them invade the entire field of their understanding and tend at once to transform themselves into acts. We have shown that crowds suitably influenced are ready to sacrifice themselves for the ideal with which they have been inspired. We have also seen that they only entertain violent and extreme sentiments, that in their case sympathy becomes adoration and antipathy almost as soon as it is aroused is transformed into hatred. These general indications furnish us already with a presentiment of the nature of the convictions of crowds. Today, the Western world is in the grip of a similar turmoil caused by the idea that we are our greatest enemy. The self-hatred extends to the belief that we are also the enemy of our mother, Earth. This self-hatred focuses on a molecule, carbon dioxide, CO2, which we despicable humans exhale. Even worse, we desecrate organic life itself by burning fossil fuel, releasing into the atmosphere more CO2 the Earth had preserved from living organisms that had passed away through the ages. Powering our industrial society with these hated hydrocarbon fuels, we have created an economic system, capitalism, that is inherently evil. The evil of capitalism extends social injustice to new heights as the racially privileged white race perpetuates their luxury by subjugating people of color and emitting enough CO2 into the atmosphere to destroy the planet. The only way to save planet Earth and, in the process, protect ourselves is to decarbonize. But even that is not enough unless we also dismantle capitalism, supplanting the economics of greed with a new vision of living and working together without prejudice to sustain Earth's limited resources for the benefit of all. In 1841, Scottish journalist Charles Mackay wrote another seminal book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Mackay, like Le Bon, was fascinated by how crazed ideas can drive whole populations into actions motivated by a bizarre, self-destructive mass psychosis that is hard to comprehend. In the preface to the 1852 edition of his book, Mackay boiled his thesis down to the following sentence. We find that whole communities suddenly fix their minds on one object and go mad in its pursuit, that millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly more captivating than the first. Mackay focused his attention on a series of fascinating crazes. He puzzled over the tulip craze that prompted Hollanders in the 1600s to spend fortunes on exotic roots producing color variations of the famous flower. He was amazed at the Crusades, where Europeans left their homes and families to seize the Holy Land for Christianity. He was astounded by the grotesque witch mania during which those believed to be possessed by Satan were hunted down and made to suffer horrific deaths. Today, the Western world is on the precipice of abandoning the economic progress hydrocarbon energy has fueled since the Industrial Revolution to save Earth from catastrophic warmth by reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that plants depend upon for life. In 2007, noted British columnist Christopher Booker and political analyst Dr. Richard North co-authored a book that took up these themes, entitled Scared to Death. Booker and North marveled that Western society since the 1980s had been in the grip of a remarkable and very dangerous psychological phenomenon. Booker and North were astounded that one mysterious threat to human health and well-being after another gave rise to society-wide fear. The list of these fear crazes was extensive: salmonella in eggs, listeria in cheese, bovine spongiform encephalopathy in beef, dioxins in poultry, and so forth. In the following paragraph in their introduction to the book, Booker and North identified why these periods of psychological insanity continue to occur among today's supposedly well-educated and technologically sophisticated populations. Each was based on what appeared at the time to be scientific evidence that was widely accepted. Each has inspired obsessive coverage by the media. Each has then provoked a massive response from politicians and officials, imposing new laws that inflicted enormous economic and social damage. But eventually, the scientific reasoning on which the panic was based has been found to be fundamentally flawed. Either the scare originated in some genuine threat that had become widely exaggerated, or the danger was found never to have existed at all. Booker went on to examine the pattern behind these scares, finding the elements in common. One was that the supposed danger had to be something universal to which we might all be exposed, like global warming and climate change. The threat must be novel, like the assumption that the developed world is bent on warming up Earth to hazardous levels by burning more and more hydrocarbon fuels until they are all exhausted. The threat must be plausible, but there must also be a powerful element of uncertainty. The uncertainty allows alarmist speculation to run wild, imagining the damage that might result. For example, the warming of Earth caused by anthropogenic CO2 until Earth is hazardous to human life. Finally, society's response to the threat must be disproportionate. For example, when the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, demands that all governments agree to implement decarbonization schemes devised by international agreements, for example, the Paris Climate Accords. Even when the threat is not wholly imaginary, the response eventually seemed out of proportion to reality. The dawning of the Internet promised to bring a new era of free speech. The open access to information quickly developed into easily created blogs to express dissident views of all kinds. But ironically, the technology welcomed as a liberating tool has transformed into a tool giving totalitarian governments increased ability to suppress speech that deviates from the government-approved version of the truth. The United States Justice and Intelligence agencies now can monitor all electronic communications, including the keystrokes made on a laptop computer in writing a book. Australian geologist Professor S. Warren Carey, who propounded the expanding Earth theory we will examine in Chapter 8, warned that challenging orthodox beliefs in science promised no glory. In the epilogue to the 1988 book Theories of the Earth and Universe that he wrote as a professor emeritus, Carey warned that the more radical the advance from the current orthodoxy, the more certain will it be scorned and rejected. Carey understood this in personal terms. Carey suffered the scorn of those geologists who were wedded to plate tectonics as their continent formation paradigm for articulating and defending his theory of an expanding Earth. Yet Carey had the wisdom to understand that not all challenges to orthodox thinking are necessarily correct in their views. In his last paragraph to the book, he wrote the following: Should we then give credence to every heretic and iconoclast with the naivete or the zeal or persistence to challenge the established order? Of course not. Most heresy is doubtlessly false, yet latent there are the gems of the age. To discriminate unerringly within doctrine and within heresy needs a keener mind than any yet, but this must be our ever unattainable goal. I have dedicated this book to Mark Morano, the creator of ClimateDepot.com. For decades now, Mark has challenged global warming and climate change orthodoxy. International global warming conferences have thrown Mark out and closed their doors to him. Books by global warming enthusiasts have printed the vilest denunciations of Mark's views and arguments. Mark has suffered the scorn Carey warned was inevitable for those who do not go along with what we will argue in this book is a mass delusion of Charles Mackey proportions. Yet Mark Morano has persisted, determined to pursue scientific truth about the climate with a purpose to prevent the Western world, and in particular the United States, from committing economic and political suicide over a scientific hoax of historic proportions. When the government mandates and subsidies run out, the fields of rotting wind turbines and rusting solar panels will be a monument to the folly of decarbonization. Should a new ice age come within our lifetimes, we will be around to lament the folly that sought to reduce atmospheric CO2 by destroying capitalism. But should that day arrive, we fully expect the IPCC to blame the new ice age on the global warming that anthropogenic CO2 caused. Part 1. The Politics of Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change. Chapter 1. Julian L. Simon, Eco-Sage and Natural Resources Optimist. Why is there so much false bad news about the subjects of the environment, resources, and population? An even tougher question is this one. Why do we believe so much false bad news about the environment, resources, and population? Julian Simon, Hoodwinking the Nation, 1999. After a career as an economics and business professor, Julian Simon passed away prematurely at 65 years old in 1998 in Chevy Chase, Maryland. At the end of his life, Simon held a position as a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., his last job after a long-time career at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, followed by an academic position at the University of Maryland. Born in 1932 in Newark, New Jersey, and educated at Harvard University, Simon received his Ph.D. in business economics from the University of Chicago in 1961. Among green energy true believers, Simon has become infamous for taking a contrarian position on energy resources, arguing that our perception of scarcity is a psychological fear, one not validated by the current or historical factual record of energy abundance. In the 1999 foreword to Simon's first book to be published posthumously, Hoodwinking the Nation, author Ben Joseph Wattenberg, then a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., commented that Simon often felt angry that he was being ignored or ridiculed by opponents who belonged to a vast Malthusian population environment resources conspiracy of crisis. Today, Malthusians have captured the politically correct mainstream media, rejecting Simon's contention that supplies of natural resources, including energy, are not finite and exhaustible. Simon saw the human intellect as the ultimate infinitely renewable resource and its potential as unlimited. He argued we would never run out of energy resources, including oil, coal, and natural gas, provided our energy resources are mixed with intellect. What distinguishes Simon from the Malthusians was that Simon saw human beings as the solution, not the problem. In direct contrast, Malthusians see human beings as a menace that threatens the very survival of the planet itself. Wattenberg understood this precisely, noting the attacks on Simon were often intensely personal. Simon's detractors demeaned him by stating his doctorate was merely in business economics and that he taught business-oriented subjects like advertising and marketing. Simon was ridiculed for starting a mail-order business and daring to write a book on how to run a successful and profitable one. Never mind that he studied population economics for a quarter of a century, and the mail-order book is still in print and in its 5th edition, Wattenberg commented. Simon was perplexed that the environmental movement did not appreciate his extensive research and many publications about natural resources. What drove the enviros crazy, Wattenberg explained, was the following. But, irony again, it was Simon's knowledge of real-world commerce that gave him an edge in the intellectual wars. He knew firsthand about some things that many environmentalists of the time had only touched gingerly, like prices. If the ultimate resource was the human intellect, Simon reasoned, and the amount of human intellect was increasing both qualitatively and quantitatively thanks to population growth, education, and technology, why then the supply of resources would grow, outrunning demand, pushing prices down, giving people more access to what they wanted, with more than enough left over to deal with pollution, in short, the very opposite of a crisis. Wattenberg calculated correctly that Simon's knowledge of the business world gave him an edge over the Malthusians in the intellectual wars. Suppose Simon is correct that the ultimate human resource was the human intellect. In that case, Wattenberg argued, it could also be right that our supply of natural resources would grow over time, outpacing demand, pushing prices down. Wattenberg correctly understood that Simon's vision is a severe threat to the supposed crisis in natural resources that the Malthusians desperately want us to believe is inevitable. Simon's argument is simple. Scientifically proven facts contradict the Malthusian doom-and-gloom narrative we see pervasive today in popular culture. Appropriately, Simon titled his autobiography, published posthumously, A Life Against the Grain, the autobiography of an unconventional economist. Contrary to everything Simon argued in his numerous published writings, today's politically correct popular culture demands universal acquiesce to the proposition that human beings have created the conditions of our demise as a species. About energy resources, the politically correct popular culture requires an agreement that our wanton burning of hydrocarbon fuels has tossed so much toxic carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we have created a greenhouse effect that will result in catastrophic climate change. In characteristic prose, Simon began hoodwinking the nation with an essay summarizing the human history of utilizing natural resources, including energy, as follows. Every resource economist knows that all natural resources have been getting more available rather than more scarce, as shown by their falling prices over the decades and centuries. And every demographer knows that the death rate has been falling all over the world. Life expectancy almost tripled in the rich countries in the past 2 centuries, and almost doubled in the poor countries in just the past 4 decades. This is the most important and amazing demographic fact, the greatest human achievement in human history. It took thousands of years to increase life expectancy at birth from just over 20 years to the high 20s about 1750. Suddenly, about 1750, life expectancy in the richest countries began to rise so that the length of a life that could be expected for a baby or an adult in the advanced countries jumped from less than 30 years to perhaps 75 years. Then, starting well after World War II, the length of life that could be expected in the poor countries leaped upwards by perhaps 15 or even 20 years because of advances in agriculture, sanitation, and medicine. It is this decrease in the death rate that has caused there to be a larger world population nowadays than in former times. Today, the politically correct mainstream media would brand anyone daring to publish an argument favoring continued global use of hydrocarbon fuels as an environmental lunatic or possibly even an ecological criminal. At the end of his life, Simon realized his optimism regarding the human capacity to utilize natural resources for our betterment as a species would brand him as a fringe nutcase. I was not cut out to be a mafia boss, Simon wrote in the preface to his autobiography. I am more like a competent and hard-working plumber or building contractor or burlesque show baggy pants comedian, though I have more kooky ideas than most of them. Yet throughout his life, Simon insisted the results of his studies and his writings would turn out to be correct. Over the years, I managed to acquire a student-used copy of Simon's 1981 book, The Ultimate Resource. On the title page of the book, the student handwrote her assessment of Simon's work. The author is a rich white male who has never left his office, world of graphs, equations, and charts that he bases all his theories on. Graphs, for example, charts that are not comprehensive and only tell if population is up, if aggregate output is up, if fertility, mortality is up, but none of the other factors, environmental consequences, inequalities, humans are a resource, no limits to their abilities and innovations. Exploit the Earth and other planets if necessary to serve humans. Income up, no intrinsic value in nature, only there to serve man. The polemical tone of these comments clarified that already by the 1980s these arguments on the left were entering the realm of ideology. Reading those comments today, I am not surprised that in this age of the neo-Marxist critical race theory, the student began her analysis of Simon's work with an ad hominem attack, pointing out that he was a white man and an academic. The student dismissed the research Simon documented in the book by insisting today's natural resource policies have produced no adverse environmental consequences and economic inequality. So what system would the student have preferred? Would using fewer resources to preserve a more pristine environment be better, even at the cost of shortening life expectancies? Would that have been fairer to all races, all sexes, all cultures, and all religions? Today, university courses rarely teach Simon's economics. Why? Because he refused to accept the orthodox conviction that we humans apply our limited intellects only to exploit, for our selfish good, the precious and scarce natural resources of our mother, Earth. The Malthusian view has convinced millions that Earth has entered a new and final hypothesized era of geological time, the Anthropocene era. Malthusians insist that anthropogenic carbon dioxide will cause such catastrophic global warming and subsequent climate change that human activity is responsible for bringing about a coming sixth extinction. Malthusians argue that the sixth extinction will dwarf the previous Big Five extinctions, in which nearly all life on Earth disappeared, rivaling even the giant meteorite that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous period, some 66 million years ago. Malthusians warn us that the sixth extinction will be the last this time, and we will have no one to blame but ourselves. Simon took a lot of abuse during his life for running against the politically correct popular culture by not adhering to Malthusian views. However, in his final analysis, Simon understood it was more important to be right about natural resources than to have a mass audience applaud his genius. That was especially true when we appreciate that the need to decarbonize and move to a zero-emissions world if we are to save the planet are all views Julian Simon found hopelessly uninformed. Why we will never run out of oil. In his revised 1996 book, The Ultimate Resource 2, Julian Simon devoted Chapter 11 to the question, "When will we run out of oil?" In the chapter title, Simon gave a one-word answer to his question: never. Simon argued that energy is the master resource because energy allows us to convert one material to another. He argued that the low energy costs afforded by hydrocarbon fuels enable modern technological society to thrive. On the other hand, if there were to be an absolute shortage of energy, that is, if there were no oil in the tanks, no natural gas in the pipelines, no coal to load onto the railroad cars, then the entire economy would come to a halt, he wrote. Or, if energy were available but at a very high price, we would produce much smaller amounts of most consumer goods and services. Simon proceeded to elaborate. The history of energy economics shows that, in spite of troubling fears in each era of running out of whatever source of energy was important at that time, energy has grown progressively less scarce, as shown by long-run falling energy prices. Simon traced fears of energy resource exhaustion back to an 1865 book published in London by W. Stanley Jevons, one of the 19th century's most outstanding social scientists, entitled The Coal Question, an inquiry concerning the progress of the nation and the probable exhaustion of our coal mines. Jevons argued Great Britain's industrial progress would halt because industry would soon use all available coal. Jevons filled his book with detailed analyses of coal mines showing mine by mine the estimated amount of coal remaining, the annual consumption of that coal, depletion ratio, and the duration of the supply. He anticipated with uncanny precision the bell-shaped curve that in the next section of this chapter we will hear was typical of M. King Hubert's 1950s peak oil graphs. In his despair that the UK would soon run out of energy, Jevons further concluded, obviously incorrectly, that there was no chance oil would be an alternative resource able to solve the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?